The guests. A young man and his wife were on a trip to visit his mother. Usually they arrived in time for supper. They had gotten a late start, and now it was getting dark. They decided to look for a place to stay overnight and go on in the morning. Just off the road, they saw a small house in the woods. Maybe they rent rooms, the wife said. So they stopped to ask. An elderly man and woman came to the door. They didn't rent rooms, they said. But they would be glad to have them stay overnight as their guests. They had plenty of room, and they would enjoy the company. The old woman made coffee, brought out some cake, and the four of them talked for a while. Then the young couple were taken to their room. They explained that they wanted to pay for this, but the old man said he would not accept any money. The young couple got up early the next morning before their hosts had awakened. On a table near the front door, they left an envelope with some money in it for the room. Then they went on to the next town. They stopped at a restaurant and had breakfast. When they told the owner where they had stayed, he was shocked. "That can't be," he said. "That house burned to the ground 10 years ago. The old man and woman who lived there died in the fire." The young couple could not believe it. So they went back to the house. Only now there was no house. All they found was a burned-out shell. They stood staring at the ruins trying to understand what had happened. Then the woman started screaming. In the rubble, there was a badly burned table, and on the table was the envelope they had left there that morning. Cold as clay. There was a wealthy farmer who had a beautiful young daughter. He cared for her more than anything on earth and called her his heart's delight. Many young men came to visit her and asked for her hand in marriage, but she wasn't interested in any of them. Then, one day, she met a boy who worked in the stables and she fell in love with him. The boy came from a poor family and the farmer did not think he was a good enough match for his daughter. To keep them apart, he sent the girl to live with her uncle who had a farm 50 miles away. After the girl left, the boy fell into a deep depression. Trying to forget about his lost love, he took a job as a sailor and went away to sea. On the voyage, the young man got sick and gradually wasted away. When he died, everyone said it was of a broken heart. When the farmer learned of the poor boy's fate, he felt so guilty that he could not bring himself to tell his daughter the terrible news. Unaware of her lover's sad end, the girl continued to dream about the bright future they would someday spend together. A year passed and, one dark night, there was a knock on her uncle's door. When the girl opened the door, she found her lover standing there, holding the reins of a pale white horse. "Your father asked me to come get you," he said. "Is there anything wrong?" asked the girl. "You'll see when we get there," he replied. She quickly packed some clothes and together, they rode off into the night. She sat behind him on the horse, her arms clutched tightly around his waist. "The moon is bright and death is riding with us," he said. "Are you not afraid?" "I am not afraid because I am with you," she replied. The boy complained of a headache. She put her hand on his forehead. "You're as cold as clay," she said. "I hope you are not ill." The girl tied her handkerchief around his head. They rode through the night and before long, they reached the farm. The girl quickly got down from the horse and knocked on the door. "Who's there?" her father demanded. "It's your daughter," she replied. "Didn't you send for me?" "No, I certainly did not," said her father. She turned to her lover, but he was gone and so was the horse. They went into the stables and found the horse in a cold sweat and trembling with fear, but there was no sign of the boy. Terrified, her father finally broke down and told her the truth about her boyfriend's death. They went to see Jim's parents and decided to open his grave. When they lifted the lid of the coffin and peered in at the corpse, they saw that, tied around his head, was the girl's handkerchief. Sounds. A long time ago, there was a house that stood on the bay near Mobile, Alabama. It was known as the Madison Mansion and it had been vacant and boarded up for years. Most people in the area kept well away from it, frightened by its uncanny reputation. Anyone who passed by couldn't help wondering what evil had transpired in the old place. Trespassers who dared to enter the old house usually fled during the night, telling tales so grisly that they were almost beyond belief. One night, 3 fishermen were caught in a quick-moving storm and managed to make their way back to shore. Drenched by the rain, they spotted the mansion and decided to take shelter in the rickety old place. Once inside, they made a fire in the fireplace to keep themselves warm and ate a cold supper. Then, the 3 men pulled their oilskin coats tightly around them and lay down on the floor to try and get some sleep. However, as soon as they dozed off, they were plagued by terrible nightmares of treachery and murder. Lying awake, the men heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps upstairs. It sounded like more than one person, marching back and forth. "Who's there?" called one of the fishermen. The footsteps suddenly stopped. They heard a woman scream. The scream turned into a groan and died away. The house was quiet again. Just then, the man who had called out felt something splash against his forehead. Something was dripping from the ceiling and forming a small, red puddle on the floor. To their horror, the fishermen realized it was blood. All of a sudden, a door upstairs crashed open and the floor shook with the sound of heavy footsteps. It sounded like a woman was being chased by a man. The frightened fishermen heard disembodied voices in the darkness. A man shouted in anger. A woman cried out in pain. They heard objects being flung here and there with a crash. Long howls of horrible laughter rose and filled the house. It went on and on until the fishermen thought they would go mad. Then, there was silence. The fishermen huddled together and listened. After a few minutes, they heard something coming down the stairs. It sounded like someone dragging something heavy that bumped on each rotten step. The scraping and thumping noises came through the front hall and the front door opened. It sounded like something was flung outside, landing with a thump among the weeds. Then the door slammed shut and again, there was silence. There was a thunderstorm outside and the house trembled as if it was about to collapse. Rain was pounding against the sagging walls. The terrified fishermen couldn't bear to stay in the place a moment longer and decided to flee. Just as they reached the door, a flash of lightning filled every room in the house with a green blaze and one of the men saw a ghastly face staring at them from the stairs. It was so horrible that it looked as if it came from hell itself. A crash of thunder deafened the terrified men and they ran out into the storm, never to return. Nobody ever knew for sure what terrible deeds had been done in that house. The mansion was built shortly after the American Revolution by an Englishman named Madison who was a rich recluse. He lived there with his daughter who was said to be mentally ill. Nobody ever saw her and the servants were kept well away from her. They never had any visitors and never went out. One day, without a word of warning, Madison suddenly left for England and wrote to his servants, instructing them to sell the house. The daughter was never found. She just disappeared. After that, the house changed hands many times, but nobody could ever stay there for long. Footsteps. From the time I was old enough to notice things, I didn't like that house. I was afraid of the upstairs. I never felt safe there. Mama always kept the light burning at bedtime because I was afraid of the dark. One evening, when I was 9, my sister was downstairs and I was asleep in bed. She was expecting Mama to come home at any moment. When she heard the front door open, my sister called out, "Hello, Mama." But there was no answer. She heard footsteps, but they didn't sound like Mama. Her footsteps were light, but these were heavy, like a man. "Who's there?" my sister called, but there was no reply. The footsteps continued up the stairs and wandered into all the bedrooms, but when my sister called out again, "Who's there?" the footsteps stopped. She was young and afraid, but she knew I was sleeping alone up there, so she took the lamp and searched all the rooms. She even went into the attic, but she didn't find anyone. My sister went back down to the dining room, but as soon as she sat down, the footsteps started again. They came down the stairs, through the dark kitchen, and then the door of the dining room where my sister was sitting slowly began to open. She was scared out of her wits. "Get out!" she screamed. The door slowly closed and the footsteps moved out through the kitchen, towards the front door. She heard the door open and shut, so she ran to the window to see who it was. There was nobody in sight and there were no footprints in the fresh snow. That was when she realized that whoever or whatever had walked in, it wasn't human. She huddled on the couch and waited for Mama to come home. Not long after that, we moved out, but something strange happened before we left. My sister and I were in the living room when, all of a sudden, we heard terrible groans. It sounded like someone was in agony. The groans seemed to be coming from the cellar. They were so loud that our dog started howling and the hair stood up on the back of her neck. She would always go anywhere with me, but when I tried to coax her to come down into the cellar with me and investigate, she wouldn't go. The cellar was well lighted, so my sister and I went down, following the groans until we came to a little alcove and there the groans ceased. I wanted to dig right there on the spot, but there was no time. I've always felt that if we had, we would have found the cause of all our trouble. Perhaps someone's bones were buried there. We moved away soon after that, and Mama would never let me ask the people living there today if they had heard anything. We were all glad to get out of that house. Basket. Gabriel Fisher spent the evening in the pub, with his dog Trotty by his side. It was just before midnight when he finished his last drink and started for home. Outside it was cold and frostly and as silent as the grave. He thought he saw a figure moving in the distance up ahead. As the man walked on down the road with his dog, he saw that it was a woman walking ahead of him. She was carrying a basket on her shoulder and it was covered with a white cloth. When he caught up to her, he looked to see who it was, but it was dark and she was so bundled up against the cold that it was hard to see her face. Trotty started to growl at her. "Good evening," Gabriel said. "What brings you out so late?" The woman didn't answer. They walked on in silence for a while. Then Gabriel said, "May I carry your basket?" Without a word, the woman took it off her shoulder and handed it to him. From inside the basket, he heard a small voice say, "That's very nice of you," and that was followed by wild laughter. Gabriel was so startled that he dropped the basket on the ground. The white cloth slipped off and out rolled a woman's severed head. He looked down at the head, and he stared at the woman. It's your head," he cried in horror. His dog Trotty gave a howl and fled in terror. As the woman stooped down to pick up her head, Gabriel took off running too. The woman chased after him, holding her head in her hands. He could hear her footsteps behind him. She was gaining on him. Then, he looked down and noticed something rolling along the ground beside him. It was the severed head. With a ghastly laugh, the head rolled in front of him, trying to trip him up. Gabriel managed to jump over it. He could hear the slap, slap, slap of running footsteps behind him. Then, the head sprang into the air and sank its teeth into his ankle. Gabriel screamed with pain and shook the head off. He tried to run faster, but the woman's body and her head stayed right on his tail. The head sprang into the air again and bit into his other leg. He let out another scream and kicked the head away. Just then, Gabriel came to a small stream. With a mighty effort, he leapt across it and kept running, not daring to look back until he got home. His dog Trotty was waiting at the house when he returned. Gabriel looked back into the darkness, but the headless woman and her severed head were gone.